There are few things more unwelcome in a home than the sight of roaches scurrying across the floor at night, or a marching line of ants streaming across the kitchen toward the food. To a settler family, these crawling invaders were a constant battle, threatening the cleanliness of the home and the safety of the precious food stores. And they had no chemical sprays to stop them. But the settlers were clever and determined, and they knew that certain plants, placed in the right corners of the home and kitchen, could drive the roaches and ants back and keep them from invading. They tucked these plant guardians along the shelves, in the cupboards, across the thresholds, and around the foundations, building a fragrant barrier the crawling pests would not cross. In the next half hour, I am going to show you 7 plants the settlers used to keep roaches and ants out of the house, where they placed each one, how they used it, and why the crawling insects could not bear it. And number 5 is a common plant, very likely in your kitchen right now, that the settlers trusted to turn the ants away at the door. To a settler family, a home overrun by roaches and ants was more than an embarrassment. The pests fouled the food, spread filth through the home, and were a constant, exhausting battle to keep down. Protecting the kitchen and the food stores from these invaders was daily work, and the settlers used every plant and every trick they knew to win it. A quick and honest word before we begin. Everything I share here is history and tradition, offered for curiosity and for the love of old, fading knowledge. It is not medical advice, and it is not pest control advice. Some plants are potent and have look-alikes, so never use any plant without proper knowledge. With that understood, let us step back in time. Welcome to the American Settler Garden, where we dig up the forgotten plant wisdom of America's pioneers, the families who kept their homes and kitchens clean and guarded against the crawling pests using only the plants they grew and gathered. Picture the inside of a settler's home, with its open shelves, its sacks and barrels of stored food, its cracks and gaps in the rough wooden walls and floors. To a roach or an ant, it was a paradise of food and hiding places. The settlers could not seal their homes the way we do, so instead they learned to make the home itself unwelcoming, filling the corners and cupboards with scents the crawling pests could not abide. They understood that ants and roaches, like so many insects, navigate by scent, following invisible trails and sniffing out food from afar. A strong, sharp plant scent laid across their path could break those trails, confuse their senses, and turn them back. And so the settlers placed their fragrant guardians exactly where the pests tried to travel, along the shelves, the thresholds, and the cracks. And as we go, notice how much of this defense was about the invisible world of scent. The crawling pests live in a landscape of smells we can barely imagine, following trails and signals we cannot see. The settlers, without knowing the science, learned to wage their war in that hidden world, laying down scents that blinded and confused the invaders. It was a clever, subtle kind of battle. Much of this knowledge came from the old country and much from the native peoples and the hard experience of frontier life. Together, it became the practical defense of the settler kitchen, and like so much of it, it faded when the sprays arrived. Today, we remember it, beginning with the first plant. Number 1, bay leaf. The settlers learned the bay leaf's guarding power from old world kitchens, where it had protected stored grain and flour for countless generations before ever crossing the ocean. It was knowledge carried in the memory of every careful housewife, handed down from mother to daughter, that a few fragrant leaves tucked in the flour would keep the crawling pests and the weevils at bay through the long winter. The bay leaf, that fragrant dried leaf we drop into soups and stews, was one of the settlers' most trusted guardians against the crawling pests of the pantry. Its distinctive, pungent aroma, so pleasant in cooking, is something roaches, ants, and many other insects strongly dislike. Settler families tucked dried bay leaves along the pantry shelf, inside the flour and grain containers, and in the corners of the cupboards where the pests liked to travel and feed. The strong scent of the leaves helped keep the roaches and ants, as well as weevils and moths, away from the stored food. A few bay leaves laid among the provisions were a simple, fragrant guardian of the family's winter stores. The aromatic oils in the bay leaf are the source of its power, strong and lasting even in the dried leaf, and unwelcome to the crawling insects that came hunting for food. The settlers found that a pantry guarded by bay leaves was troubled less by the pests, and so they kept the leaves tucked wherever food was stored. It was one of their simplest and most reliable defenses. And the bay leaf shows how the settlers turned their own kitchen into its own defense. For the very same leaf that flavored the winter stew also guarded the grain it was stored beside. There was a beautiful economy to it, a single humble leaf serving the pot and the pantry at once. The settlers wasted nothing, and they asked every plant to earn its keep many times over. And the bay leaf was, of course, a treasured seasoning as well, flavoring the family's soups, stews, and roasts. A plant that guarded the pantry and seasoned the supper was a true homestead favorite. To use it as the settlers did, tuck dried bay leaves along your shelves, in your food containers, and in the corners of your cupboards. The next plant filled the home with a scent the pests fled. Tucked along the shelves and in the food, the bay leaves guarded the family's winter stores faithfully. A fragrant defense as simple to use as it was reliable through the long, cold months. Number 2. Mint. The settlers found mint doubly useful against the crawling pests because it guarded by scent both along the ground, where it broke the ants' trails, and in the air, where it discouraged the roaches from gathering. A plant that worked on two fronts at once and grew so willingly besides was exactly the kind of generous guardian the frontier kitchen depended upon. Our faithful mint returns, for the settlers trusted its sharp, cool menthol scent against the crawling pests of the home, just as they did against the flying ones. Roaches and ants strongly dislike the powerful smell of mint, and the settlers used it freely to guard the kitchen and the pantry. Settler families laid fresh or dried mint along the shelves, in the cupboards, and across the thresholds where the ants marched in, and they tucked it into the corners where the roaches hid. The strong menthol scent helped break the ants' scent trails and made the area unwelcoming to the roaches. A handful of crushed mint by the doorway or along the shelf was a fragrant line the crawling pests were reluctant to cross. The menthol oils that give mint its cool bite overwhelm the senses of ants and roaches, masking the food scents they follow and disrupting the invisible trails the ants use to guide one another. The settlers knew that a kitchen scented with mint was a kitchen less troubled by the marching lines and the scurrying shadows. They planted it by the door and brought it inside freely. And mint's power against the ants was especially prized because of how the ants themselves work, marching in their long ordered lines along invisible trails. To break that trail with a sweep of fragrant mint was to throw the whole marching army into confusion, scattering the line and turning the invaders back. The settlers delighted in so simple a way to undo so organized an enemy. And mint, ever generous, gave its leaves for tea, for flavor, and for freshening the home besides. A plant that guarded against the crawling pests and made a fine cup of tea was a humble treasure. To use it as the settlers did, lay mint along your shelves and thresholds, and plant it by the kitchen door. The next plant was the cucumber the ants could not abide. Laid along the thresholds and shelves, the mint broke the marching lines and freshened the kitchen at once. A willing guardian the settlers could renew from the patch by the door whenever they wished. Number 3. Tansy. The settlers planted tansy at the foundations of the home with special care, for they knew the crawling pests sought out the cracks and gaps, where the walls met the earth, the very seams of the house. A fragrant border of tansy laid along that vulnerable line guarded the whole boundary of the home, at once turning the invaders aside before they could find their way through the gaps. Tansy, that tall herb with the button-like yellow flowers and the sharp camphor scent, was one of the settlers' great guardians against the crawling insects of the home. Its powerful, bitter smell made it a formidable foe of ants, roaches, and flies alike, and the settlers planted and placed it with purpose. Settler families planted tansy by the doorways and the foundations of the home, and they laid bunches of the dried herb along the shelves, in the cupboards, and in the corners where the pests gathered. The strong scent was believed to drive away ants and roaches, and to keep them from crossing into the home. A border of tansy at the threshold was a fragrant wall against the crawling invaders. The potent aromatic oils that give tansy its sharp scent are its weapon, strong enough to repel a wide range of insects and unwelcome to the crawling pests that tried to enter. The settlers valued it as one of their most reliable guardians, planting it where the pests came in. I must add a word of caution, for tansy is a potent plant to be handled with respect and knowledge, and never eaten. And the settlers valued tansy at the threshold above all, because it stopped the invaders at the very door, before they ever reached the food within. A guardian planted at the foundation, and the entryway was a wall around the whole home, turning the pests aside at the boundary, rather than fighting them in every corner within. Prevention at the threshold was always the settlers' preferred defense. And so tansy stood as a faithful guardian at the threshold, turning the ants and roaches back before they ever reached the food. To use it as the settlers did, plant tansy by your doors and foundations and lay dried bunches along your shelves, always with respect for its potency. The next plant was the pungent bulb that guarded the kitchen. Planted at the foundations and doors, the tansy turned the crawling invaders back at the very boundary of the home, a fragrant wall the settlers trusted to guard the whole house at once. Number 4. Garlic. The settlers valued garlic's guarding power so highly because it cost them nothing extra at all, drawn from the braids hanging in the cellar for the family's food. To tuck a clove in a corner, or steep one in water for a pungent sprinkle, was simply to ask a little more of a plant they grew in abundance anyway, the perfect thrift of the careful homestead. Our faithful garlic returns once more, for the settlers used its sharp, pungent scent against the crawling pests of the kitchen, just as they did against so many other invaders. Ants and roaches strongly dislike the strong, sulfurous smell of garlic, and the settlers put it to work in the home. Settler families placed cloves of garlic along the shelves, in the corners of the pantry, and near the cracks and thresholds where the ants and roaches entered. They also made simple garlic preparations, steeping crushed garlic in water to sprinkle along the pests' paths, laying down a pungent barrier the insects were loath to cross. The strong scent helped break the ants' trails and turn the crawling pests away from the food. The sulfur compounds that make garlic so pungent are its power, among the strongest plant scents of all, and deeply unwelcome to the crawling insects. The settlers knew that a clove tucked in the corner or a pungent sprinkle along the threshold helped keep the pests at bay. It was a humble, ever-present guardian drawn from the same bulbs they cooked with, and garlic's great virtue as a guardian was that it was always there, always to hand, drawn from the very same braids the family cooked with all winter long. A clove tucked in a corner cost the settler nothing and was never in short supply. This easy abundance made garlic one of the most practical of all the home's defenders, a guardian pulled from the kitchen itself. And garlic, of course, was food, medicine in the old traditions, and protection all at once, one of the hardest working plants of the whole homestead. To use it as the settlers did, place cloves along your shelves and thresholds, and sprinkle a garlic steeping where the pests travel. And now we come to the one I promised you. tucked in the corners and steeped for a sprinkle. The garlic laid down a pungent barrier. The pests were loath to cross, guardian drawn freely from the family's own kitchen stores. And the cleverness of cinnamon against the ants delighted the settlers, precisely because it worked not by killing but by confusion, simply erasing the trails that guided the marching lines. There was no battle, no mess, only a fragrant line laid across the path and the bewildered ants turning back. To defeat an enemy so completely and so gently, with a sweet spice from the baking shelf, was a small kitchen miracle. And now we reach number 5, the one I promised you, a common plant, very likely in your kitchen right now, that the settlers trusted to turn the ants away at the door. Number 5, cinnamon. The settlers delighted in cinnamon's power against the ants because it asked no battle and made no mess, only a fragrant line laid quietly across the threshold. To a busy housewife with 100 chores, a defense as simple as a sprinkle of sweet spice across the doorway, leaving the ants bewildered and turned back, was a small and welcome blessing in the daily work of the home. Cinnamon, that warm, sweet spice we treasure in our baking, was one of the settlers' most trusted guardians against ants. That rich, strong scent, so comforting to us, is powerfully disruptive to the ants, and the settlers used it to guard the thresholds of the home. Settler families sprinkled ground cinnamon or laid pieces of cinnamon bark across the thresholds, along the shelves, and at the cracks and entry points where the ants marched in. The strong scent of the cinnamon disrupted the invisible trails the ants laid down to guide their fellows, breaking their lines and turning them back at the door. A line of cinnamon across the path was a fragrant barrier the ants would not readily cross. This is the clever heart of how cinnamon worked against the ants. Ants find their way by following scent trails, each one laying a path for the others to follow to the food. A strong, overpowering scent like cinnamon erases and confuses those trails, leaving the ants lost and disorganized, unable to reach the food. The settlers used this knowledge to guard their kitchens simply and effectively, and rosemary earned its place as an evergreen guardian that lasted and lasted, its fragrant needles holding their scent long after softer herbs had faded. A bundle of rosemary on the shelf guarded for many weeks, a steadfast, woody sentinel that asked little and served long. The settlers valued a defender so durable and so fragrant at once. And cinnamon, of course, was a precious and beloved spice, sweetening and flavoring the family's food and filling the home with its warm scent. A plant that guarded against the ants and sweetened the baking was a true kitchen treasure. To use it as the settlers did, sprinkle cinnamon across your thresholds and along the paths where the ants enter. The next plant was the fragrant herb of the windowsill. Sprinkled across the thresholds, the cinnamon erased the ants' trails and left them lost and turned back, a sweet and simple defense any busy housewife could lay down in a moment. Number 6. Rosemary. The settlers kept rosemary at the kitchen windows and doors above all, because its strong evergreen scent lasted so long and stood up so well to the warmth of the cooking space. A pot of rosemary on the sill guarded faithfully for weeks on end, a durable, fragrant sentinel that needed little tending and gave both protection and seasoning from the very same plant. Rosemary is a fragrant, needle-leaved herb with a strong, fresh, woody scent, and the settlers valued it as a guardian against the crawling and flying pests of the home alike. That powerful aromatic smell, so wonderful in cooking, is one that ants, roaches, and other insects dislike. Settler families kept rosemary in pots on the windowsills and by the doors, and laid sprigs of it along the shelves and in the cupboards, where its strong scent helped discourage the crawling pests from entering and feeding. In the kitchen especially, a fragrant pot or bundle of rosemary was a guardian standing right where the pests tried to invade. It protected the food and seasoned it besides. The aromatic oils that fill rosemary's needles are the source of its power, strong and lasting. and unwelcome to the insects that came hunting. The settlers found that the crawling pests were less troublesome near the rosemary, and so they kept it at the windows, the doors, and the shelves. It was a fragrant, evergreen guardian of the home. And rosemary was a treasured seasoning and a herb of the old traditions besides, valued for flavor and for memory, and used in countless ways about the home. A plant that guarded the kitchen, seasoned the roast, and freshened the home was a homestead favorite. To use it as the settlers did, keep pots of rosemary at your windows and doors and lay sprigs along your shelves. The final plant was the bitter sentinel of the pantry. Kept at the windows and along the shelves, the rosemary stood as a lasting, evergreen guardian of the kitchen, fragrant and durable, guarding and seasoning from the very same fragrant plant. Number 7. Wormwood. The settlers reached for wormwood when the crawling pests had taken hold in the hidden corners and the deep stores, for its bitter strength reached where the gentler herbs could not. A bunch of dried wormwood laid in the worst infested cupboard or storeroom was the firmest defense they had, a powerful bitter guardian for the hardest fought corners of the home. We close with wormwood, that silvery, intensely bitter herb that has guarded so much of the settler home. For the settlers knew it turned away the crawling pests of the pantry, just as it did the snakes, the rodents, the flies. Its powerful bitterness made it one of the great all-purpose guardians of the homestead. Settler families laid dried wormwood along the shelves, in the cupboards, and in the corners where the roaches and other pests gathered, and they hung bunches of it in the storeroom. The intensely bitter scent helped keep the crawling insects away from the stored food and out of the hidden corners they loved. A bunch of bitter wormwood was a faithful guardian of the pantry and the stores. The intensely bitter aromatic oils of wormwood are its weapon, so strong and unpleasant that few insects could bear to linger near it. The settlers trusted it as one of their most reliable defenders of the home, placing it wherever the pests were worst. I must add a word of caution once more, for wormwood is a potent plant, to be handled with knowledge and respect, and not for eating. And so wormwood stands as a fitting plant to close on, the bitter silver sentinel that guarded the settler home against so many invaders, the crawling pests of the pantry among them. To use it as the settlers did, lay out dried wormwood along your shelves and in your cupboards, always with respect for its potency. Laid in the cupboards and the stores, the bitter wormwood guarded the deepest and most infested corners, the settlers' firmest defense for the places the gentler herbs could not reach. So there you have it. 7 plants the settlers used to keep roaches and ants out of the house. Bay leaf, the fragrant guardian of the pantry. Mint, the cool menthol breaker of the ants' trails. Tansy, the sharp sentinel of the threshold. Garlic, the pungent guardian of the cracks. Cinnamon, the sweet barrier the ants could not cross. Rosemary, the fragrant defender of the windowsill. And wormwood, the bitter sentinel of the stores. Every one of them helped keep the settler home clean and the food safe, turning the crawling invaders back with nothing but fragrant leaves, pungent cloves, and the wisdom of where to place them. The settlers could not buy a clean, pest-free kitchen. They built it with plants tucked in every corner and laid across every threshold, a fragrant fortress against the crawling pests. And these 7 are only part of the settlers' defenses for the home. As I dug into this, I found far more than I could fit into one video. The full fragrant arsenal the pioneers used to keep their homes clean and pest-free, all laid out in simple pages. I gathered it into a guide called The Settler's Guide to a Pest-Free Home. If you would like a copy to keep, the link is waiting for you down in the description below. And if you believe this old knowledge is worth keeping alive, worth passing on the way the settlers passed it on, then go ahead and subscribe. That is all it takes to see the next one, because the settlers guarded more than their kitchens with these plants. Next, I want to show you the plants the settlers kept inside the home itself to keep the moths, the flies, and the bugs out of their rooms and linens and away from the family. That story is playing right here. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next one.